Now to the reason you're all here, and to our panel and some of the team who've delivered this fascinating insight into the future of live performance. Sarah Ellis is Director of Digital Development for the Royal Shakespeare Company, where she has collaborated with Google and Intel, amongst others, to explore new artistic initiatives and partnerships that have national and international recognition. She's produced projects with Birmingham Rep, the Soho Theatre, the South Bank Centre, Albany Theatre, and many others, and still finds time to also chair commissioning and digital development agency The Space. Pippa Ill is the head of literary at the RSC, where she oversees the commissioning and development of all of the company's new plays, adaptations, and translations. In her role as writer and dramaturg on Dream, she was an expert and advocate on adaptation, ensuring that Dream had Shakespeare's DNA running through it. Robin McNicholas is co-founder and creative director of experimental studio Marshmallow Laser Feast. MLF have created fantastical light shows for Miley Cyrus, collaborated on music videos for U2, and been blurring the lines between the virtual and real as pioneers of groundbreaking immersive technology projects, including In the Eyes of the Animal and We Live in an Ocean of Air. And Robin was the director for Dream. So please do use the Q&A boxes throughout our conversation. You'll have an opportunity to ask the panel your questions later, and we'll be asking you to unmute yourself and ask your question live if you want to. And if you don't want to, just type it in the chat and we'll say it for you if you like. Now, if I can, I'd love to start by asking you, Sarah, how would you describe Dream yourself? And also, how did this amazing collaboration really get started?
So the collaboration started a few years ago, where so it's all under the remit of the Audience of the Future, and specifically the demonstrator program to explore the future of live performance. And as the RSC, we'd been working in isolation, so we'd been exploring that ourselves. But the Audience of the Future program provided us an opportunity to think more broadly, look at live performance much more holistically. And so the collaboration evolved through bringing together a series of companies and to kind of not just think about theatre, but think about liveness and co-presence and what new things are evolving across the sector that would create a bigger impact. So it was a really, I'd known of Gabby's work at Manchester International Festival for a long time. I'd known about Marshmallow Laser Feast's work and the Philharmonias, and it felt a really natural fit for us to look at music, festival, theatre, and work that was emerging through this space. And then alongside that, work with technology companies and researchers to help us do that. So often call it a Star Wars bar of people. And that's a really important thing to celebrate, that we're not looking at a one-size-fits-all future. We're certainly looking at a future that is diverse, curious, and also kind of goes out across. So whatever Manchester do in this, that's a celebration for us, and we celebrate each other's work in that way.
Can I ask you as well then, in terms of forging this Star Wars bar, how did you go about creating your kind of coalition of the willing, and how challenging was it to translate and overcome in terms of maybe different languages or terminologies or ways of working?
I think Robin can pick this one up too, but just to sort of just a context, I think that it's really important to say that the purpose of Audience of the Future is to look at innovation and R&D in those new models. So in some ways, that's its purpose, to look at taxon, the labeling of things. And by working with such a range of practitioners, you can genuinely do that rather than just looking introspectively at your own practice or your own form. So I defer to Robin in some of that too.
It's interesting because I think one of the things that connects MLF, the Philharmonia, and the RSC, as well as Manchester International Festival, is that we've been exploring areas that effectively have always required a lot of R&D anyway. And so the process of experimentation within different organizations has meant that there's a shared passion and a recognition that it's actually critical if you're going to be pushing in this particular field. And I think that it's where it gets exciting as well. I think having the benefit of who by the point of this project knew us quite well. We'd met on the circuit effectively on at festivals like Sundance New Frontiers and Storyscapes and IDFA, which is the Dutch festival, where practitioners of the XR scene are able to share their work with audiences. But I think another aspect where these languages meet is that really we'd been in a situation where we'd been attending the festivals, but also felt driven to make sure that the projects exist outside of the festival circuit as well. And this is something that the Philharmonia have done, the RSC have done, and what MLF have been striving to do, and what effectively Manchester International Festival celebrate as well. And so there was lots of commonalities, but fortunately lots of differences as well. And I'd say that one of the other aspects when we all came together that was critical was the curation of the creative atmosphere within the different organizations. And Sarah, with her clever ways of just creating a respectful, generous environment that allowed us to step forwards together in the spirit of innovation, really. And that, you know, there were lots of obstacles that I'm sure we'll get onto.
With regard to that, can I, and this is probably for all three of you really, in terms of, I don't know if it's been described consistently, it was a large-scale research project, and I'm very interested to know, what were the research questions you set out to answer?
Well, some of the questions were, can we reach a wide audience of 100,000 people? This was something that was initially presented to us in a physical LBE space, a location-based experience, which presented its own challenges in terms of getting audiences to a bricks and mortar venue. And when COVID hit, we pivoted and had to let go of that bricks and mortar LBE project, which was pretty painful because we'd effectively just pretty much got 3/4 of the way through. We'd recorded the Ravel score that was used in Dream on Friday the 13th of March last year, and that was the last opportunity really to record before everything locked down. But what happened was the pandemic happened. We had to pivot and then look at one of the questions that the audiences of the future presented was 100,000 audience that attended for more than 3 minutes. So there were conversations about what makes a meaningful experience, and this mysterious 3 minutes cropped up. I think internally we've always known that it's surely more meaningful for visitors to attend for the whole duration of a production, which now that the data is trickling through, we're happy to say that most people who joined the Dream experience online watched the whole thing, including the Q&A at the end, which was important to us.
To add in terms of those research questions?
Yeah, well, I was just about to say we had some really big ones, like how many people we could engage with, how they could interact live, how we could present a live performance, something that felt like it was really happening there and then for an audience, and an active dialogue between the performers and the audience. We had some really big ones. We had some really like niche ones as well. And like one of my big questions was, can you put 16th century poetry into a gaming engine and not have a sort of terrible toe curling reaction to that? Like, is that possible? That was one of them. Can you have an emotional attachment to an avatar? You know, how can you use theatrical methodology for puppeteering? So there were some really, really narrow niche ones and some really big, broad ones as well, I think.
To add to that as well, we were in different silos doing individual research projects as well that all factored in to this demonstrator. And so MLF, for example, we're researching deformable object tracking. How can we make more tactile aspects? How can we make digital physical interfaces effectively? And as a result of that, our team picked up Unreal Engine and started to bend and flex it and eventually wield it and be able to use lots of the learnings from that initial deformable object tracking research in very different ways in the demonstrator of Dream. For instance, all the physics simulations of the wind blowing are a direct result of deformable object tracking. And much of the nuts and bolts practical mixed reality set came from that same area of research.
Okay. Is it right? Can I move on to the element of kind of the narrative and the character and the idea of you chose to create, Pippa, an original piece of work based on A Midsummer Night's Dream rather than do it or take scenes from it. Why did you make that decision?
I think primarily because it's a change in form. I think we were moving from, we weren't presenting a play, we were presenting or exploring, seeking to present an immersive experience. So I think the key difference to that is that it's a different ask for the audience's imagination. So in a play, what you do is you allow the audience to imagine the world, and then you set them running on a complex set of plots and character interactions from beginning, middle, and end. In an immersive experience, I think essentially what you do is you create the world and you drop the audience into it. So it's a really different form of storytelling. You're allowing the audience to feel and experience the world rather than have to work their imagination to create it for themselves. So I think a lot of the storytelling was visual, a lot of the storytelling was musical, and a lot of the storytelling was from the sound and the environment. And you fall into a trap, I think, quite easily if you try to put a play into an immersive experience of showing and telling, which is it's not very good dramaturgy if you're doing the same thing twice. So that's really why we wanted to allow the audience to explore a wood, and there are some magical elements to the wood, but also Robin and I very early on discovered that we both felt quite strongly that it would be an amazing thing to pull off if we could essentially create a wood but allow the audience to experience what's amazing about a real wood. So if you create an unreal wood, and then what you do is you say, okay, let's show the audience what the canopy feels and looks like. What's the sound of that? What's the sensation of being up there? What's it like underground? What's the root system feel like and sound like? So we were very keen to explore the realities of what's magical about wood, I think.
Describing that, you also made some interesting decisions around when the avatars and the actors kind of came together and they were simultaneously there. I just wondered again, what made you make that decision to bring those, like to try and show the magic to a certain extent?
Well, there's a really amazing trick that Shakespeare uses a lot, which is a play within a play. And what happens in those plays is that they essentially tell the truth. And we were quite excited by that as an idea. I mean, MLF have made amazing strides in playing with and exploring perception and what's real and what's not real, and the line between. And we felt it was a really exciting opportunity to allow the audience to assess the truth and to see the truth. And the actors really went with that as an idea as well, and really explored it. So that was the primary reason, was this sense of reality and exploring reality.
You talked there about the audiences, and again, Sarah, I'm interested in, I know it's early days, but in terms of the audiences this project reached, because of the unique nature of what it was, have you got any interesting kind of observations yet in terms of either how they may have reacted differently, or if there's been anything that's kind of consistently come through in terms of audience reaction?
Yeah, I think that what Pippa and Robin are describing, audiences embraced that wholeheartedly, and they showed up in ways that were absolutely delightful. Been looking at the Q&A questions about what most surprised you, and actually what was most surprising was our audience. And it was quite reaffirming to see an audience, like when we were onboarding and the clicker go up, that anticipation of a live performance, which when you're in the building you feel as a buzz. Before we had that moment with our audiences. We scheduled it to be programmed globally. That was a really important aspect of shifting performance times to where people were. And I think it's fair to say that we've reached tens of thousands of audiences, and people have come back. So there are many people anecdotally that talk about, I saw it once and I wanted to see it a few times, and audiences engaging in that way. But globally we reached around about 80 countries, and we certainly got an unprecedented number of new bookers to the RSC. And I think it is that, like, you know, you can hear through Pippa and Robin that genuine collaboration and interrogation through our worlds was very, very genuine. And I think audiences really responded to that. And they came with us on the curtain drop. They found such humanness in the storytelling too. And I think that, you know, we are looking at new forms, and if we are going to look at new forms, we have to take our audiences with us. And anecdotally, I think everyone was up for the conversation as well, which is why the Q&As work brilliantly, is that you could have that conversation afterwards. And Pippa talks about it going to the pub, which is what you do in real life in Stratford. That was a really important angle. So our audiences, sometimes we don't ask our audiences what they think so genuinely. And actually there is a co-creation aspect when you're looking at new form to very much have them with you. And I think that it was really successful in wherever you were coming from, what age group you were coming from. It was really diverse in the range of audiences. We found with a younger audience, there was a much more, you're in there, you're experiencing it without question. And some of our audiences that are used to seeing us in a certain way and experiencing theatre in a certain way needed some codification around that, which is where the foyer lobby aspect was really important, and that we brought them into this world together and everyone joined it together at the same time.
And in developing it, were you acutely aware, I suppose, that interesting for Pippa and Robin, was it you were aware this was a global audience that would be experiencing this, and were you making considerations because of that?
To an extent, I think that from the MLF camp, we were visual storytellers, and I was playing the fish out of water card a heck of a lot with Pippa, in that it was the first time really that I was directing with dialogue outside of much shorter form, short films, things like that. And so I felt really excited about that challenge. And in terms of a global audience, the way that we make our work usually at MLF is that it's non-verbal, and that generally the visual storytelling aspect is the central focus. And we're playing that fish out of water card, and what I mean by that is that my exposure to 16th century poetry isn't that hot, you know, and I loved it as a challenge to really pick up on the dialogue in such a way and embrace it and think, well, do you know what? I think that if we just trust in our process and allow the visual storytelling to toe the line as well, we feel as though this is something that we could potentially share. And we had various conversations quite early about translations and all the rest of it. But from a visual and, well, effectively an audiovisual standpoint, that felt as though that it was an effort to reach out globally, but to different age ranges and demographics as well. It was very important for us to have a production that didn't require lots of expensive VR kit, for example. It was important that people could access this through their laptops, mobiles and tablets, if they were lucky enough to have those devices and a broadband connection. But that as a level of access is much broader and more democratic, we hope, than owning a fancy graphics card and a specific VR, dedicated VR PC. So yeah, that was a key aspect. And the other thing is that I think we're all very human centric in our process, and Shakespeare's work is, as stories go, really universal as well. And so that was something that I think we were leaning into.
Sarah, Robin's touched on this already, but I'm very interested to understand the pivots that the pandemic kind of necessitated in the project, and that this notion of having to kind of rethink. How much did you really need to do a turn and change, and how did you go around doing it?
It was so hard. It was really, really hard because it's people, and we had to grieve something that wasn't going to happen, and so we stopped production like straight away. And the first thing we did was make sure freelancers were paid and people were all right. That's what we did immediately. That was a really important thing to do. And then we commissioned a consultation across the consortium and then some audience research to find out what audiences wanted at this time and how we could create a piece of work that was emerging through this and that was going to connect with audiences not in person. That's not what we'd been briefed to do, if you know what I mean. We were exploring a physical experience, looking at distribution with audiences online, bringing that together. But we very much had a home for that experience, and there was a whole design and there was a whole team working on that. But on the other side of that is what skills did we need to do a remote audience only and potentially a remote performance. We didn't know where we'd be in the challenges of COVID. We didn't know what we were facing there. But the audience research overwhelmingly came back with the audiences were craving togetherness and liveness, which was a delight to hear. That was a really important thing. It was like the heartbeat of what we were doing, but it also highlighted a huge digital inequity, and we couldn't take this forward knowing that without addressing it. So we have talked and there's been debate, why is this not in VR and stuff like that, and we would want to do that, and we wanted to do that, and we'll think about that going forward. But in the time we had to do it, the time challenge was phenomenal that we had to deliver this. So we had to go, we'll use it using immersive technologies and using the most cutting edge technology, but we have to distribute it equitably with the technology that people have in their homes, which was, we made assumptions around and did research around television, desktop, mobile, tablet. And that was a huge constraint. But actually through that, I think we can confidently say we have found an audience with this to take forward, and, you know, in the next stage, think more broadly around AR, VR, for example, mixed reality in terms of its distribution. But I think this is the performance it needed for now, for people needing to connect equally. And it may have brought some audiences that would never experience this work in any other way. And I think that's an important thing at this time. But it was a really, really challenging process to go on.
And it's important there, I think you highlight that role, I think, that game engines are now playing in terms of changing mainstream forms of entertainment. And that's something that, Robin, I'm interested in your thoughts on, really, which is we are hearing how much games engines are being used in other sectors like film and TV and so on. And I'm just wondering, now having gone through this, what role do you think they might play when it comes to the evolution of theatre in the way that Sarah's just described some of those important issues?
I think that they're going to play a huge role. And if we use Unreal Engine as an example, there's an incredible amount of energy being put into making sure that the tools that allow practitioners like us to directly plug into lighting desks. And so I think if you were to look at the evolution of Unreal Engine, for example, they've reached a point now where they're dealing with interactive media, but they're able to then plug into lighting desks, plug into video servers, plug into other peripheral devices like AR and VR headsets, and cater for broader audiences outside of gaming. And that definitely includes theatre. To look at a few examples, 2019's Childish Gambino performance at Coachella in a full dome, where you're seeing Unreal's capabilities for dealing with a 180 dome with stitched graphics cards to create one giant texture and allow for the real-time manipulation of those visuals that are synchronized to music. It just exposes the creative opportunities, and the significant thing to acknowledge is that it's real-time as opposed to pre-baked. And that's where it's significant, because there's more empowerment there's more creative empowerment. It means that we are able as creative practitioners to work and effectively put the power in the actors' hands as well, to empower them, to allow us to improvise and to do things in real time that previously, say with real-time mocap, for example, real-time mocap's been around for a fair while, but not to the level that we can and have used on Dream, in that we can pipe it directly out to an audience. And what it does is it erodes this line between the makers and audience, and it creates new bridges and new conversation. When it comes to creating narratives in new forms of narrative, it's so exciting to think, look, this isn't constrained now. It's not lumbered with the geographic constraints that we've had in the past. Why can't we invite audiences from Japan and India into Stratford-upon-Avon, into a theatre there? And I think that there's important questions to be asked, like, is it culturally relevant? And it needs to make sure that there are infrastructure, and it's not just as simple as tech for tech's sake, press a button, here we go, this is how theatre is going to be now. But what it does allow is just new opportunities and new creative opportunities and dialogue for creative practitioners and collaborations like this to start lifting the lid on new forms. And I think it's really important to do that, especially in a global society, particularly when we all are more digitally literate now because of the pandemic, you know.
It's very interesting. You talk about the way in which these things will empower, and I'm kind of interested as well, kind of responding to that, Pippa, in terms of what traditions and practices do you think will withstand the transition, or certainly withstood this transition from sort of a linear into a digital experience?
That's a great question, and I to be honest with you, when I thought, I've been asked that question before, and I thought about it, and I looked down what you would normally, like, totted up what you would normally, the ingredients you'd normally have for a theatre show. You have actors performing live in an active dialogue with its audience. Okay, so we did that. You have costume, set, lighting, sound, music. We had all of those things. You have a script that you rehearse over a series of weeks where you develop the story and the characters. We did all of that. So essentially, all of the major building blocks for how you make a theatre show, we didn't necessarily use them in the same way or the same order that you would if you were making a theatrical production. But what was so amazing about it was that as all of the organisations began to merge and work together and mesh together, we had all of the cultural practices from all of those organisations all together in one room. So, you know, if you say to Robin, you know, when you're making the type of work that MLF normally make, what sort of process would you normally go on? We didn't shift that far. What was amazing about it was that we were all working together. So we had the expertise and the process muscle memory from how we would normally make our work, and we put it all together in a sort of pressure cooker. So I think, a very long answer to your question, most of the key building blocks in a R&D process and also in a rehearsal process, we actually quite fluidly crossed over into what we made. They were just perhaps not as recognizable. They were just different in other ways, but they're all kind of there. I think what, for me, the biggest challenge perhaps was the order of the technical versus the sort of building of the performance. So usually when you're making a show, you work on the nuance of the performance and the storytelling first, and then you bring in bit by bit elements of prop and tech. But we couldn't do that for this because the two things were completely bound together from the beginning. So we were teching from day one and creating with the actors. And actually, I'm a convert. I think that's a brilliant way to go, because the two things feed off each other. They're in dialogue with each other and they grow together. And actually what you get is a rich piece of work.
And in terms of reaching new audiences, and again, I think this is one for all of you probably, we've seen musicians and sports stars embrace these new platforms like Fortnite. Do you think we're now at the stage where an organisation like the RSC would create a virtual venue inside a world or a platform like that? Because clearly this is now in your gift, right?
I think we did create a virtual venue. That was the lovely thing about it, but it kind of evolved through the process of the R&D, and that's as it should be. I think we wanted a space that wasn't attributed to a technology platform, actually, and that I think it's very much a start of how we take that forward. I think that I wang on about it a lot, that's a technical term, but ritual in theatre and the new forms of connection, and how a lot of this is not about, yeah, a lot of it is about the behaviours that we don't recognise that we actually do when we experience things together. So it is, it's an interesting use of language in our gift. I think it's in all our gift to develop that as a, and not just the RSC. I think it's much more interesting if we take our badges off, which is what I really wanted with the collaborations. We put our badges down and we came to a collective challenge. So I think more sectorially, it's sort of like, how can we not just look at sort of, there's something really interesting that we found through the pandemic where a 400-seater theatre can be a 10,000-seater theatre. And that's really interesting in terms of the work and the work that comes out. And we're not just looking at seats, we're looking at co-presence. So I personally think it's, I think it's something that we take forward much more collectively, because that will be more interesting.
I suppose then my last question, I think, before we go to the Q&A, then is where would you like to go as a group after? Have you had any thoughts about where this will take you?
I think,
so many thoughts.
yeah,
Not yet properly discussed, but yeah, loads of ideas.
It's difficult because now that we've scratched the surface and identified, effectively we've built a story world, and with that story world, obviously there's new questions about how audiences engage with that, and it's very different to film. If you shoot, lock and edit and then distribute a film, it's done and dusted. But much like a game, you know, games are iterative in that way. And so creating a story world that can live and evolve, and you've got different windows into that story world, that's very much how I think it's how I've been looking at MLF's work for a long time. And I think it's collectively how we've looked at this, in that, you know, we've created this as a living story world. We have the breeze that blows through it that's controllable by a motion capture performer. It's musical. It's the inhabitants of this virtual forest defy the laws of physics, and they do all kinds of things that games engines are allowing us to do that you can't do on stage. You can do it in compelling ways on stage, but the interesting aspect of this being a living story world is that one of those windows can be the stage and the proscenium arch. And I think that you know, projection is commonplace within lots of theatre productions, and where there's a screen, there's a window into the story world. And so there's no reason why Dream, for example, couldn't exist on a stage. I must say that watching the live mocap in parallel with the LED screen is a spectacle in itself, and it exposes the human capacity to effectively taking multiple strands of narrative, and I think it exposes the multi-screen nature and the way in which Russian dolling of narratives can take place. You know, it wasn't just the Portsmouth mocap studio where that performance was taking place. It was taking place in people's homes as well. They were contributing. And I love this idea of a tablet being a window into the story world, as well as the LED screen in Portsmouth as well. And there were multi-screen aspects behind the scenes going on in Portsmouth too. So I think it's just so exciting, and the way we're on the first rung of the ladder, and we really hope that this has inspired lots of people. That we could talk for another 6 hours on just the interactive potential and branching narratives and new forms in that way that we were eager to explore further, but within the time frame and things like that, we just got a sniff of it and we're like, oh, the things you could do. And I will just finish off by saying embodiment, the embodiment of characters. And all the conversations around virtual beings is especially interesting, having made all of these wonderful characters that we know audiences potentially could actually embody those characters. And I think that there's again, interesting lines blurring there between makers and audience and the role of audience.
I think some of the questions that we have may touch on some of those areas. So if it's all right, I'd like to hand the floor over. And I think Matthew Lindley has a question that he wants to ask. B, can we bring Matthew forward?
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant. I was really interested in what you were saying around the parallel process of digital and story developing. And one of the things that I've often struggled with around that is the different timelines. So for example, in a rehearsal room, an idea can emerge in a kind of centered direction and where it's going, whereas to actually kind of realize that in a games engine or in an animation or in any form of digitally can take is several hours, several hundred sometimes of hours of work. And I was kind of interested in that sense of how you manage that twin track process by co-creating in that kind of way, whether there was any of those painful moments where you had to ditch what might have been huge amounts of work because the story had actually heading in a different direction, and how you kind of manage that process.
It's a fascinating process that is liberated by real time to some extent, but and the real-time process allows for happy accidents as well, new opportunities from those scenarios. But to your point, we found we were still quite time poor on the ground with the mocap suite. It wasn't ever a case of being able to just jam in the space. We effectively created the show on Zoom. And so Pippa and I think one of the interesting areas that united our creative process was the storyboarding process. And so on Zoom, we had a person called Rob Pybus who attended various script run-throughs where we talked about the different scenes, and effectively in real time he drew them up, sharing his screen. And to some extent that helped a great deal in terms of collective cohesion, and that extended into the music camp as well. And so we were able to create animatics from those storyboards that we then shared with baked music. But when I say baked music, there was a whole layer of interactive audio and interactive music that was a huge part of this research project as well, and a huge it was essential really to allow sound production, the score, the interactive score, and the unreal scenes to meld and mesh. And so in some ways, the lockdown culture of zooming in all over the place helped to some extent with the collaborative process there. I would say the narrative did evolve, and there were whole swathes of things that were shelved. In the interactivity, for example, we had got so far down the line with full screen interaction, so superimposing, and we had all these kind of occlusion maps that were piped out, and a WebGL player that there's all the kinds of technical complex things that we were trying to go with a full screen interactive experience. But the design process, it was critical to make it as simple for the user, a user of 4 and the user of 104 to interact with as well. And so through that collaborative process and iterating, we had to shelve a slightly more in-game level of interaction for a more, I would say, more obvious interaction technique of a GUI that came in, a graphic user interface. final thing is we developed all kinds of other scenes as well, such as a whole hill and dale that was presented that took months to develop. That when it came to introducing fog to the Unreal scene, you don't see it at all. And so there's things like that we realized at the end, do you know, it's not actually critical that for the story that we see the hill and dale. Let's just keep the fog as it is. And it's painful. It's really tough breaking the news to your fellow developers who are like, what do you mean the hill and dale is invisible? But I learned a lot through the collaborative process with Pippa in that way. And I think, Pippa, you're extremely good at getting out the samurai sword and just chopping and editing with being story centric effectively.
Thanks for your question, Matthew. I think let's try and get through as many as we can in the time we've got left. So B, is Robert Sloan up for an available?
Hey everybody. I asked loads of questions. This was really, really exciting. Okay, I'm going to ask the crass question, if I may. I heard on LinkedIn the rumor mill that it costs £16 million. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, I'd love to know what were the big costs. How is it kind of repeatable going forward? And yeah, where do you go from here?
So no, it did not cost £16 million.
I wish it did.
Exactly, it did not cost that. That is the total number of a lot of the audience of the Future Demonstrator Program, if you know what I mean. So that went across many projects. So that is not accurate. It cost, that was a lot. It was a lot less than that. In quite, a fraction, if I can say that. I'm not going to give you numbers. We'll say that the biggest costs were content creation and the development and actually we employed 375 people to make this work. So a lot of that went on freelance costs. Going forward, we're going to do a full evaluation of all the technology pipeline and share our learnings. So the purpose of R&D is to sort of put it all out there and then look at the modeling for that. And one of the big questions around the project, or research questions, is what are the new commercial business models to evolve through that. So we've got all the data from the audiences coming in. Many people did surveys about willingness to pay. So we can start to do some modeling around how you would create this work in the future that had an income, and that also we were testing distribution models, and you could look at small, medium and large scale business models around the distribution. So yeah, no, quite right to raise it, not crass at all. Very important for us to sectorially have that discussion, which again, I'll go back to why distributing it on mobile, desktop and tablet was so important for us to understand what the potential appetite is from audiences.
Thanks, Sarah. B, is Victoria lined up with her question?
Hello. Hi. Hello, everybody. So I did ask a couple of questions, and I just also wanted to say congratulations. It was phenomenal. I was lucky enough to attend the final performance, and it was just dazzling. So congratulations again. I suppose, again, like Robert, I'm going to be a bit crass and possibly neggy, but I was really interested to know what was I guess, a low point during the creative process, and did that actually create a pivotal moment, judging by all the complex factors involved and the overarching umbrella of the pandemic as was. Thanks.
A low point was having to being understanding that Mondays and Fridays were generally disrupted heavily by COVID tests. So effectively we had 3 proper working days. And within that, again, just recognizing that so many different departments, whether it was the sound team, whether it was music, whether it was mocap, as well as all the different departments, interaction, as well as video playback and live video, all were weighing in on studio time, and that became a very difficult thing to manage effectively. And so production managers, producers were under a lot of strain based on the problems faced with the extra time suck, which was the pandemic. It meant that we could only have 16 people in the space at any given time. They all had to have masks on. If the acting company were physically contacting one another, that would only be a 15-minute session, and then we'd have to break. So there were an inordinate amount of issues there. I'd say that one of the other aspects that was, I think, a result of that was having to let go of so many ideas, whether it was for interaction or character or scenes. For example, we had this fantastical idea of a mocap performer being the weather, and having one of the acting company puppeteering fog and puppeteering the wind. And it's something I'd really still love to do, but on the list of things to do, we never got around to rehearsing it, you know. And so there were some real low points, but I'd say overall camaraderie was really high, and one of the biggest other elements that was a point of frustration, because there were so few people allowed in the studio space. It meant that everyone who was dialing in from outside, I think, felt it a lot, and that's just the nature of this pandemic creation process.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Did anyone else want to answer? Okay. Let's try and get through a couple more if we can before 2 o'clock. I think, Bushra, are you there wanting to answer your question?
Hello, sorry, I just had the kettle on. Yeah, I really enjoyed this production. It was amazing. What was that you talked about quite a lot about how many ideas you had to put, to the wayside, but what do you think was the biggest risk you took? I mean, it's such a well-known story and people had expectations, I guess.
Yeah, I felt personally that one of the biggest risks I took was cutting up Shakespeare and gluing it together to create a pared down economic script in verse. It's an iconic play. A lot of people know it very well. A lot of people care very deeply about it. And that felt like an enormously naughty and risky thing to do as a representative of the Royal Shakespeare Company. That said, I felt able to defend that as an artistic decision because everything in that forest was taken directly from the text. So all of the plants, all of the trees, all of the creatures, all of the characters, everything came directly from Shakespeare's text. But that certainly felt very risky from a narrative perspective, because you're right, it's an iconic, very well-known text. Yeah, that would be my my personal biggest risk that I took.
I to add, there were so many risks, it's crazy. And to do real-time mocap in itself to a live audience, say, was high risk anyway. But we were creating a virtual forest from a 7x7 meter square. And what we made was a 7x7 square kilometer forest. And so the suspension of disbelief and effectively us relying on camera trickery with the actors, Puck effectively would walk 7 meters, then we would have to do a polar shift and switch the whole virtual environment around for them to carry on walking forwards. And so developing a theory of how we would do that, and that switcheroo polar shift theory of every 7 meters we spin the volume around 180 degrees, or do another kind of camera trick relating to effectively single take films. That was the biggest risk that fortunately I think we got away with.
Amazing. So did you do the switcheroo sort of in real time, or was it reacting?
No, it was sometimes sequenced, sometimes cued. And so the camera operator, we had a virtual camera operator who would walk to the end of the environment, and we had transition bushes and things like that the virtual camera would go into. We'd do our switch, and then the camera would carry on. So it's hugely complex, and one of those things that at the start of the rehearsals I was thinking, oh, these actors look frightened here. Are we just going to be dealing with this in week 4 with and just working out this patting your head and rubbing your tummy kind of scenario? But they got to grips with it straight away, and respect to them, because they were able to see staging cube as a stone for one moment that turned into a branch for the next, which became invisible for the next scene, and keeping tabs on what the mixed reality stage was at any point in time is something that I think is indicative of the choreographic aspects that are interwoven into performing arts these days. So it's not just acting, spatial awareness is critical as well.
Let's try and squeeze one more question in if we can before we finish. Lance, are you there? You got last question, I think.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So yeah, basically, well done, by the way. I didn't get to see it. What a shame, but it sounds amazing. So with theatre, traditionally very London-based or cities, etc., and I think there's been acknowledgement in UK about creating more diverse audiences. I think you've already mentioned you had a lot more younger audiences engage in this. Do you think this is a new form of storytelling that will engage a wider, more inclusive audience, not just to Shakespeare, but other forms of theatre? If not, what would the barriers be to access? And if you do think it is the way forward for more inclusion, then how is this going to be meted out across the UK for other theatrical institutions?
Well, the Royal Shakespeare Company is based in Stratford, so we're in the Midlands anyway, and we've got quite a good network there. But also, I mean, I would say that part of what the company does is research and development into a huge number of projects that don't just involve Shakespeare. So I run the new work department at the RSC, and we've got a whole laboratory full of we've got 30 or 40 different projects on the go at any one time, developing new work. So there's a hell of a lot of activity already in the Midlands, working towards how we might garner new and diverse artists and theatre makers and audiences. But probably Sarah would be better placed to answer the question about audiences and audience development.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, riffing off Pippa as well, it's really important to say we're not London based, and actually Shakespeare is our playwright in residence, but we work with a huge number of new writers and new work, and are always pushing those boundaries. I think that in terms of audiences and inclusion, it's a really good question, because often we look at inclusion as an afterthought. And I think when you're creating new systems and new platforms and new ways of connecting, if we can put that at the beginning and it not be a how do we make this ... but actually put those core values into the content creation itself.
Yes.
Thinking, it's kind of like we need to shift the entire process. And I think that that's why working with Pippa is so exciting within the RSC, is that those values are at the heart of all of that. So it's sort of the systemic change that we need is much more embedded in that we're not looking at when we talk about new audiences, sometimes actually what we're talking about is more audiences seeing the same thing that we do. And I think that what Dream is about and what we're talking about and what we're passionate about is saying, if you're looking at new audiences, you need to look at your storytelling. You need to look at where and how people feel comfortable accessing that. And you need to look at the authenticity of the voice of that too. So that's quite important. And that we, when sometimes we look at new forms as well, that's why organically creating the Dream platform, which we did, if we had signed up within the pre-existing distribution channel, we wouldn't have been able to interrogate those things in that way. So there's huge amounts there, but it's really important to accept that even when you talk about inclusivity online, there is still barriers. There is no, and we must never sit with that, if you know what I mean. We must never acknowledge going, oh wow, we've made it, we've done it. It must always be a live conversation for us. And I think that's what we're passionate about. And we have to, we did an amazing workshop with Joe Verrant from Unlimited, who, it was about the honesty of it. If you can't achieve it, don't say that you've tried, be honest about that. And that's really important too.
Yeah, that's really important.
And final note, just in terms of if you didn't see Dream and you want to see it again, it will be available on the platform in the next month or so as a passive experience for people to watch and enjoy. And I'm sure StoryFutures will share. They've shared the link, but also we'll share it when it's ready. It's not ready yet.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, I'll share that with my students. Oh, just sort of related, but just finally, skills. So future skills for whether it be professional actors or people wanting to go into theatre, so existing people in the industry, also new entrants coming into the industry. Do you think they need to learn more about the digital aspect of storytelling, like gaming engines, virtual production?
I don't think it hurts to expose people to games engines, and that Unity and Unreal Engine have effectively, they're competing, and as are other tools that have made lots of tutorials and things like that readily available. They're rabbit holes, and I think that one key aspect is just knowing your interest and skill set, because to learn creative coding or 3D modeling or producing for non-linear narratives, they're all kind of, it's useful. Having had exposure to creative coding, I'm able to engage with developers, and it's all about communication, isn't it? And understanding the timeframes of how long stuff takes, I think, is a really important aspect in the creative practice, and so communication's hugely important there, and exposure to the capabilities of games engines is something that is really available online. If you start scratching the surface, very soon you can discover where they're going.
It's also something we offer as an institution. So if you want to look it up, Lance, on our website, we offer courses and a lot of things for free to people who are interested in learning about this space. So thank you so much to Sarah, Robin, Pippa for being so generous with your time. As you said, Sarah, I think we'll distribute details as to where people can see the show. I presume not yet going to be available in its fully interactive form again, but we'll obviously hope and wish that you evolve and take this into new and exciting territory. In the meantime, as I say, thank you so much. It was insightful, and you have achieved, collectively, and the whole team have achieved remarkable things. So thanks for your time. Thanks to everybody who watched. Thanks to everybody who asked questions. And yeah, stay in touch.
Cheers, then.
Bye-bye.